Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on a deeply unsettling international crisis. We're talking about the explicit intent of the United States to annex Greenland from its NATO ally, the Kingdom of Denmark. And this isn't just about politics. It's fundamentally about Greenland's strategic value. It's a natural aircraft carrier, really, that anchors Arctic security, and, of course, the critical role of the Pacific Air Base.
And this is very much a live issue. I mean, the fact that a Danish delegation was just in Washington to discuss this and confirm they're under direct high-level pressure tells you everything. This is not some hypothetical. It's an active threat.
Right, which brings us to our central question. And it's a question that really defines this moment for the Western alliance. Does the United States' demonstrated intent, and we're talking political ultimatums, coercive threats against the founding member, does that fundamentally and immediately rupture the spirit and integrity of NATO? Or can the alliance framework somehow withstand this? I'm going to argue that this action is an existential, fatal blow. The moment the threat became credible, the alliance in spirit was over.
And I'll come at it from a slightly different angle. Look, the damage is undeniably severe. This is probably the worst crisis of confidence NATO has ever faced. But I'll maintain that the structural constraints in, frankly, the more likely path of coercion over actual occupation mean the alliance survives. It's devastated, it's less effective, but it survives on paper. The framework itself is surprisingly resilient, even to this level of betrayal.
Well, let's dig into that. What is the foundation of NATO? I mean, it's not the paperwork, right? It's mutual trust, it's absolute respect for sovereign borders. If the U.S. just wanted a bigger military footprint, the 1951 Defense Agreement already lets them do that. They could reactivate bases, expand their presence, but that's not the objective here. The goal is annexation. It's about substituting the autonomy of Greenland with U.S. sovereignty and doing it by forcing Denmark aside. And that intent, in itself, is a catastrophic violation. It completely undermines the entire premise of Article 5. If a NATO ally is threatening to seize territory from another founding member, then the order we've lived under since 1945 has effectively collapsed. We don't need to wait for a shot to be fired. And leaders in Europe know this. I mean, you look at the statements. The Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, he was unequivocal. He said if this happens, it would signify, quote, the end of the world as we know it. He wasn't being hyperbolic. He was recognizing that the core principle, that shared commitment, is just gone. The alliance becomes a hollow shell. The spirit that makes Article 5 feared is already dead.
That's a very compelling argument about the moral collapse of the alliance. And that loss of cohesion is severe, I agree. Tusk's comment reflects this deep anxiety, especially in Eastern Europe. However, I'm just not convinced that a fatal, immediate rupture occurs, simply because the most destructive option, a full-scale military attack, is so politically and institutionally impractical for the United States.
Impractical, maybe. But is it impossible?
Totally unacceptable. But we have to be realistic. An outright invasion of a G7 partner and a NATO ally, I mean, that's the kind of option that just blows up the whole board. The problem isn't just military, it's civilizational. The global reaction would be absolutely devastating. It would cripple U.S. diplomatic and economic leverage overnight. So I think the more probable scenario, based on how this administration tends to operate, is not a kinetic invasion, but sustained targeted pressure.
Coercion. We're already seeing that, aren't we? The narrative warfare, the false claims about Chinese warships being all over Greenland, which the Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen explicitly denied in that meeting. He said there hadn't been any for a decade.
Precisely. That's the opening salvo. They're trying to manufacture a crisis to justify intervention without an invasion. So coercion, using economic pressure, diplomatic blackmail, it severely damages trust and it forces Europe to distance itself, yes. But it doesn't legally or functionally dissolve the alliance framework. NATO would technically still exist on paper. Its formal demise is delayed. And you can't ignore the domestic checks. The U.S. Congress, slow as it is, can create entanglements. It could even reverse a unilateral annexation. It's a brake on an immediate collapse.
And that brings us right to our first real point of contention. What does alliance destruction even mean? Is it the statute, the piece of paper, or is it the spirit? I'd argue the ultimatum itself is the rupture. When the U.S. executive says they'll get Greenland the easy way
or the hard way. That is not diplomacy. That's calculated ambiguity designed to force you to escalate. It's the kind of language that precedes crises that, frequently end in wars. The very act of issuing that ultimatum to a founding member shatters the security guarantee. The moment Denmark has to seriously plan for potential U.S. aggression, the alliance has stopped working. I mean, how can you stand side by side with a partner who just threatened your territorial integrity?
I see why you emphasize the rhetoric. I do. But the structure's survival isn't dependent solely on heated words. It depends on action, or the lack of action. The U.S. already achieves its main security goals, that missile early warning, the space surveillance, through the existing 1951 agreement. A costly, disastrous attack is strategically unnecessary for their core defense objectives. The goal is political control, and you can get that by making life impossible for Denmark without ever needing to phonetically breach Article 5. So the most likely path being economic pressure and diplomatic coercion. That leads to severe political separation. Europe closes off, distances itself, maybe even gets closer to rivals like China. It's a profound decay, sure, but it's not the sudden structural disappearance of the treaty.
But the evidence suggests the Allies are already treating this as a systemic rupture. They're moving past the legal document. I mean, look at the European reaction. Germany, Sweden, Norway, France, they all announced the deployment of military forces. Observation or reconnaissance, sure, but they explicitly left the door open for combat forces. That's critical. They aren't waiting for U.S. assurances. They're preparing for a security environment without the U.S. guarantee. When allies start mobilizing against each other, the alliance has already failed.
They're reacting to the threat, absolutely. But reacting to a loss of credibility is different from formally dissolving the alliance. Those deployments show profound distrust, yes, and the need for European strategic autonomy. But if the U.S. had chosen immediate military action, Article 5 would be invoked. NATO would implode instantly. By choosing coercion, they shift the burden to Europe. Now Europe has to decide whether to formally dissolve the treaty, and that carries huge political risks for them too. The structure is designed to absorb political shock, and while this is unprecedented, the treaty framework remains a legal, if maybe meaningless, reality until someone formally revokes it.
Which leads perfectly to our second contention, the power struggle between executive action and these institutional barriers you mentioned. You're emphasizing checks, like Congress, but I think the executive almost always stays ahead of those constraints in foreign policy. Speed is everything. The executive can just do it. A unilateral announcement of annexation, a fait accompli that is incredibly difficult and time-consuming for Congress to undo. The damage done in that immediate aftermath, that's irreversible.
I'm not convinced those barriers are so negligible. In fact, I'd say the biggest institutional barrier isn't Congress. It's the devastating global cost, an actual military takeover that would invite these terrible questions about U.S. reliability worldwide. It's not just about Denmark. It's about South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, all of them. The world would immediately be asking, look, if the United States did this to Denmark, a founding NATO ally, why won't they do it to me? That catastrophic reputational risk is a powerful, if not absolute, deterrent.
But is it powerful enough? I mean, when ambition and this kind of ideology are running so high, does that risk really stop an executive? The Danish delegation made it very, very clear that Greenland will remain with Denmark. The Greenlanders themselves have a right to self-determination, yet the executive's stated goal is to just disregard that. The willingness to ignore those foundational principles proves that those barriers might not be enough to contain this ambition. They're building the justification to ignore those costs right now.
That's a crucial point about self-determination, but it actually strengthens my position. The lack of support from the Greenlanders makes any long-term annexation plan completely non-viable. Even if the executive manages a quick seizure of military bases, holding that vast territory without local consent against international law, it makes the long-term political costs astronomical. The territory becomes ungovernable. The U.S. executive is powerful, but it can't govern a hostile, massive territory without cooperation. So the cost analysis pushes the U.S. toward coercion, not occupation, which allows the framework, the treaty itself, to limp along.
Collective defense. That certainty relies entirely on trust. By threatening military action, by demanding annexation,
The U.S. has introduced fundamental uncertainty into the system. Greenland has become the point where the West has to decide if it even still exists as a bloc, and the current trajectory indicates that the trust necessary for it to function has already failed. The fatal rupture happened the moment the most powerful member proved it was willing to use force against its friends.
I agree entirely that the order established since 1945 is facing its most critical moment. But I'll reiterate that the structure of NATO is robust enough to survive these rhetorical and coercive attacks. The result isn't an immediate technical dissolution. It's a profoundly weakened, less credible alliance, a ghost of its former self, maybe, but legally still intact. The key outcome isn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual decay and a strategic realignment, with Europe moving away from the U.S. So while we can debate the mechanism of the end, sudden rupture or slow rot, these events underscore a critical breakdown of trust.
A critical moment indeed, regardless of the speed of the decay. Thank you for illuminating both the technical and spiritual dimensions of this crisis.
My pleasure. A thoughtful discussion on a frankly terrifying prospect.